Putin's war in Ukraine, initially presented to the Russian people as a swift and necessary operation, a campaign, a sort of crusade against liberalism and against the LGBTQ community, a campaign for orthodoxy, has turned into a protracted and increasingly unpopular conflict. Zelensky's recent attacks into the Kursk region, his invasion or his incursion within Russia's borders, the claims are that he's now seized 1,000 square kilometres, highlights a key shift. The war is no longer confined to Ukrainian territory, but now touching on Russian soil, and instead of rallying the populace to defend their homeland, these incursions have been met with a striking indifference among ordinary Russians still left in the Kursk region. This lack of a vigorous response speaks volumes about the current state of Russian society and the broader dynamics of the conflict and the future of Putin. It's a muted reaction to attacks on Kursk that suggests a deep-seated apathy among Russians and decades of state propaganda, economic hardship, and political repression mixed with propaganda that's blaming NATO for all of this. And in fact, even today, there's stories that, it's NATO bombs that took out the bridge, NATO missiles that took out the bridge. Well, actually, it's no longer believable. It's no longer important. The population is both numbed and cynical. The Kremlin's narrative of a special military operation to protect Russian speakers in Ukraine no longer resonates with many Russians, especially as the war drags on with mounting casualties and economic strain. And this apathy is not just towards defending the state, but also reflects the broader disillusion with Putin's regime. But despite this apparent indifference to Putin, there are undercurrents of dissatisfaction within Russian society. Despite that, the war's impact on the economy, particularly through sanctions and military expenditure, is being felt by ordinary citizens. But it's emerging as grumbling and whining and sort of quiet gossiping, not any sort of rising, fervent desire to replace Putin and the Kremlin authorities. The discontent is reflected in the increasing number of chatter on Telegram, for example, but the protests are small and heavily suppressed, and criticisms coming from unexpected quarters, including military bloggers and former Putin allies. But it's very similar to the Prigozhin march on Russia, on Moscow, which went almost unnoticed, unchallenged. No one was out on the streets to defend Moscow. In fact, they were cheering in Rostov. These rumblings could coalesce into a significant movement against Putin, but I don't think it's going to happen very fast. The heavy-handed repression, the pervasive surveillance is very effective, and the lack of any unified opposition have made it difficult for dissent to crystallize into any organized resistance. The fear of reprisal, coupled with the Kremlin's control over any media narrative, ensures that dissatisfaction remains largely subterranean. The war is also not producing the kind of patriotic fervour seen in previous conflicts, such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or the French resistance against Nazi occupation. Instead, the Russian populace seems in a quiet state of desperation or acquiescence, where the idea of life under Ukrainian occupation is not necessarily viewed as worse than life under Putin's autocratic rule. It's a profound indictment of the regime, revealing a nation that is tired, disillusioned, not with war, but with Putin. 25 years to the day today since he took power. And increasingly, the population is open to the idea that any change, even one imposed by an external force, might be preferable to the status quo. And comparing the current situation to the Soviet-Afghan War or the French resistance underscores the unique dynamics at play. The Soviet-Afghan War, despite its unpopularity, was fought far from the Soviet homeland, and the casualties and economic impact, while significant, didn't provoke any large-scale complaints. In contrast, the French resistance was a response to a foreign occupation driven by a deep sense of national identity and a desire for liberation. There's no resistance in the Kursk region. In the current conflict, Russian society isn't rallying around to defend the nation in the face of what could be perceived as an invasion by Ukraine. Instead, many Russians appear to be questioning the legitimacy of the war itself, are increasingly indifferent to the prospect of defending the regime that has offered them little but repression and economic hardship. And if anything, there are videos popping out saying, well, what's Putin done? Quite openly. Putin's war is stumbling, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Russian people. The lack of a strong response to attacks on Russian soil, coupled with growing dissatisfaction, coupled with isolation, suggests the war is far from achieving its objectives and may instead be undermining the very fabric of the Russian state. This isn't the Afghan war, nor is it the French resistance. It's a war being fought by a regime increasingly disconnected from the people it purports to represent. The future of Russia now hinges on whether this discontent will remain a muted grumbling or evolve into a more formidable challenge to Putin's rule. And meanwhile, there are people who are anticipating what Ukraine is going to do next and gathering to witness and report. Suddenly, after a year and a half of stalemate, the initiative seems to have gone back to Ukraine.